This is the Visual Principles Part 2 lecture, which is the second half of the Visual Principles series, which is the first assignment in the Archie 100 Basic Graphic Design class. In this lecture, I'm going to be discussing the second half of this assignment and some more core concepts that will be important to you as you advance your design career. The concepts I'm going to introduce in this lecture are a little bit more abstract and not as directly related to the second assignment, but they are still very important key concepts to our work as graphic designers. So as you begin to work on part 2 of this assignment, you will realize that you are being tasked to express emotions now and abstract ideas through these same constraints that we've dealt with in part 1. This can be really difficult at first, but we are now getting more to the core of what we do as designers, because typically we spend time expressing more abstract and emotional-oriented ideas through our design work. You want to approach these abstract ideas by thinking about the principles that we learned in the first part and the connotations they have. I talked about some of these in that lecture, so you could consider watching it again, but for example, we know that an asymmetrical layout is going to be more dynamic and active. Asymmetry is going to be more valuable for conveying chaos than symmetry. It would probably be almost impossible to convey chaos with symmetry. So think about the way that those concepts stack and what they really mean and how you can leverage what you know about those to apply to the words that you'll select for the second half of this assignment. But first I want to talk about some other concepts that are important. And the first one is proportion. And proportion is really related mostly to scale. That's what we talked about, the size and the relationship of scale. Because proportion is really the relationship between two elements in design and how they relate to each other. Again, most often this is through scale, but it could also be through color, degree, or setting. And good proportion adds harmony to a design. It really enhances the ability of a design to work. Oftentimes it can also be an important communicative factor in explaining what we're looking at. This is an example, which is an infographic about how to make different kinds of coffee drinks. And you'll notice that proportion is very important to this graphic. The proportion of espresso to steam milk or milk foam or water is what really determines how these drinks are created. So the graphics having a strong proportional relationship is very important to this. And although this is more of a direct or an exact example, proportion exists to everything that we work in. We always want to be considering, how much of the space is being dominated by one thing and how much by another. And we actually want to try to avoid dividing things in half and creating perfect symmetry, unless that is our absolute goal, because like I said in the first lecture, we're going to create stronger compositions if things are divided more in a 1/3, 2/3, or in this kind of asymmetrical style. Contrast is another concept that I've discussed, but we haven't talked about it specifically, and that's the juxtaposition of opposing elements. Colors on the color wheel, black and white, light and dark, horizontal and vertical, different directions. And contrast allows us to emphasize or highlight key elements. So if you remember that initial example we looked at for emphasis, it was all of these gray dots, and one of the dots was darker. That's a great example of contrast, because that darker dot has a higher contrast to the lighter dots, which makes it emphasized. It makes it feel like the focal point of that composition. But there's also contrast of size, space, scale, and these things can be really important to create interesting compositions. In design, it is important that there is contrast, that not everything feels the same. That's what's going to create intentional and visual appealing design. Here's 2 examples that really rely on positive and negative space. Contrast is integral to allowing positive negative space to work its magic. This poster on the left, which is the silhouette of Batman interlocking with the silhouette of Penguin, it's really showcasing the relationship between them as the hero and the villain. So it has a great conceptual appeal, but it also works really on the concept of contrast. Because it's black and yellow, those are high contrasted colors, it makes it very easy to see this division between the two of them and to recognize these iconic silhouettes. The one on the right is another poster. It's for the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, and they've taken a fork, but they've removed the negative spaces of the fork and added wine bottles that are representing those negative spaces. And it's the contrast between the black and the white and the shape of these forms that allows us to see that connection, that allows us to see both food and wine within this image. Systems thinking is something I discussed when we talked about unity and order, but we didn't talk about it directly. And systems thinking is really when designers use a system of connected concerns to drive their design. They're trying to create strong unity between the pieces that they're making. They want the viewer to understand how things connect. Packaging is a great example of this. When you go to the ice cream aisle, you can see the different brands very distinctly. And then you can dive into viewing the flavors of those specific brands, hopefully clearly as well. This is an example I showed for Unity, these book covers. But you'll see that there is a strict system here that the designer has built. Again, they use the same typefaces. They use an analogous color palette. The logo is always in the same position. All of the titles are aligned, and then the longer the title is, the more lines that appear up the book, so they all base align. So these are things that the designer has decided they're going to build into this design so that he can create or she can create this really strong sense of unity. Here's Monocle. I showed this, the magazine again, with its ability to create covers that feel very unified, that allow us to find it on the shelf or the news rack. But systems thinking can apply to other things in design as well, like logos. Recently, we have seen quite a few what we call dynamic logo systems, which are logos that are able to morph and change. And they work with some sort of systems thinking, some sort of set of rules that the designer applies, and those rules create enough constraints that they create enough similarity between all of these different marks that although they're different, they have enough similarity to them to feel unified. So this is the MIT Media Lab, and you'll notice that every single one of these logos uses 3 black squares, and one of those squares protrudes out in a 3D extrusion type of way. Yellow, one of them does red, and one of them blue. And then they oftentimes fade into one another. And below that, MIT Media Lab is always set in the same place. Another thing you might notice is that the graphic above the typography never goes beyond to the right of the L in lab. So there are these constraints that are being put on this logo, and it's those rules that are built that are allowing these to feel like a system. And it's a great example of systems thinking, and there's many more of these in dynamic logo design. Gestalt theory is one of the largest and corest principles and concepts to design. And what it means in its largest sense is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it's a concept that comes from psychology, where humans have a tendency to think about things as the larger whole rather than its individual parts. And there are different concepts that break down into Gestalt theory. And one of them is closure. You'll see this on the left in this G. Our brains automatically connect those two sides of the G together, even though there's a white space between them, and we read it as a G. We don't read these as 3 or 2 distinct shapes. Our brain connects them and automatically recognizes that that is a capital G. And that concept is called closure. This is a key concept in design. It's where our brains will connect things together and allow us to see these individual parts as a greater whole. The second concept, which is being articulated in the E, is this concept of proximity. And proximity is the idea that things that are closer together, we are going to assume are related to each other. And things that are further apart from each other, we are going to assume are not related to each other. So here, all of these black squares that are closer together and the same color allow us to know that those are related to each other and allows us to see this capital E. Continuation is shown in this S, and it's this concept that our brains assume that if something is moving in a certain direction, it is going to continue moving in that direction. So for example, this S, although we cannot see that the spine of the S, which is that center portion, we can't see it connecting as it wraps around this white rod, but we assume, again, that that line is going to continue moving down and continuing the stroke of the S. It very well could veer off and go up and hide behind the rod or completely break and not continue going, but our brains assume that that's going to continue to go in that direction. So that's the concept you'll see again and again, is this idea that if something's moving one way, we're going to assume that it continues to move that way. So it's similar to closure, but not exactly the same. Similarity is the concept that is very similar in some ways to what we talked about with proximity. And you'll see that with these two capital T's. Our brains connect those. We assume that they're related to each other, that they mean something that's the same because they look the same. So as we are looking at systems thinking or we're looking at design work, we're going to look for similarity. Our brain is going to try to break things down and find things that are similar, because that's going to cue us into what is related to each other, which will help us see the overall system. And the last one is figure ground, which I've already explained in the first lecture, but it is one of the Gestalt principles as well. And here they're showcasing it in this ligature between the A and the L. And it's this tree, right, that's hidden inside of that A. By removing the crossbar, there's kind of this tree motif. Figure ground, or positive negative space, really relies on this concept of contrast and, there being figure and ground, and that our brains can read each of them. That you can allow yourself to see the black of this A, but also to see the white of this tree. Here's another little diagram that I think is also helpful to understand these concepts of Gestalt. They're the exact same ones for the most part. Some of them are changed or actually aren't principles of Gestalt, like symmetry in the lower right. But I think this helps you to see things in a different way, like this proximity example. Here your brain is reading these as these individual columns. It doesn't read it as rows, it doesn't read it as a pattern. Because there's more space between the dots, in terms of left and right, we're reading these as individual rows. And that's important, this idea of proximity. Our brain's going to clump things together that are closer together. When viewing design, we tend to apply these principles unconsciously. We can make these connections, sometimes without us even realizing it. Very often, your perception of design is calculated so quickly within your brain that you're not always breaking down every single thing you're seeing and what that means to you. And so that's a challenge to us as designers, is how do we break these things down? And how do we pay attention to all of these principles and details? And because sometimes I even see this as a checklist. If you go through and you know that your piece has good unity and good harmony and appropriate balance, and it's following the Gestalt principles and it's using scale in an effective way, you're going to create something that's a great design. So that's my favorite thing about design, is that it can be systematic. This is not about self-expression. It's about communication. And using these tools that already almost exist inside our brain can allow us to communicate so much more effectively. It can allow us to create visual connections and relationships. It can also strengthen the overall mood or the feeling of a design. So here's 3 iconic logos that really showcase Gestalt principles. This Unilever on the left, it is a great example of proximity. All of these icons are put together in a uniform density to form this U. We see it, but it's made up of all of these smaller parts. So again, Gestalt principle, the most basic part of it, right, is that the whole is greater than the sum of all of its parts, right? The middle one is another logo, the Girl Scouts logo. And this is a great example of continuation or closure because there are some openings in this logo between the faces that break the shape up. But our brain connects them together and creates this nice, strong, uniformed shield shape that is really iconic for the Girl Scouts. Same thing in the World Wildlife Foundation. That panda is not entirely there. There's white completely bleeding out of the logo, but our brain connects it together and it sees a panda. It allows us to recognize these shapes and put them together in our brain. And it's a very simplified version, which allows it to communicate extremely quickly to the viewer. So for part 2 of this assignment, you're going to start again by sketching. But first you really need to choose the emotions you're going to work with. And in the software files, there's an emotions list that you can open, and I'm allowing you to select any 3 emotions you want to create these compositions from. But it's important to me that you don't select things from the same columns. So avoid having things that are in the same section. I really want you to jump around here. I don't want 3 fears or even 3 strong or 3 medium. I'd really like you to jump around this document and pick emotions that are very different. I also challenge you to not select ones that have a visual connotation. So things like shaky. Shaky looks like something. We know what that looks like. Or empty. We know what empty looks like from a visual perspective. Or something like horrified is going to be a lot more difficult because there's not necessarily visual cues for that. We also want to stay abstract. I'm not looking for you to create imagery. I don't want hearts or crosses or peace signs. I want it to be completely abstract and non-representational. And that's really where the challenge comes in. I want you to look at how can you communicate these words with this limited amount of shapes and these strict rules that are being applied to what you do, because all of the same rules from part 1 are going to apply. I want you to select at least 1 emotion, minimum, that is abstract. If you want to select 1 or 2 for the other ones that have more of a visual representation, I'm okay with that. But at least 1 of them needs to be completely abstract. Then you'll move to sketching. It's very similar to part 1. I want this to be systematic. I want to see what we're looking at. Is it anger? Is it peace? And then you can explore different elements that you use. You can try lines, you can try planes, you can try points, but you still cannot mix them together. You can't have lines with points or points with planes. You need to isolate each composition, but in the compositions you explore, you can try the different ones. I'm fine with that. And then ultimately we're going to post these to the discussion and pick the best ones and translate them digitally. The last part that's important is when you translate them digitally, I want you to include the concepts or principles from the first lecture that you're utilizing. So is it asymmetrical or symmetrical? Are you using scale, tension, chaos, harmony? What is involved in this layout or this composition that you're using to express the emotion you've selected? There's also a great assignment sheet and video tutorial about this to help you through. Don't forget to reference the video tutorial from the first assignment because that'll go over concepts like shape creation and masking. As always, please email your instructor if you have any questions.